It's the holiday season, so I guess what do you remember about your holiday season in Joplin? What do you remember about growing up? What was it like in the household when during Thanksgiving and Christmas? How did you guys celebrate those holidays?
Well, I don't really remember much. I do remember Christmas time. I remember we used to have a Christmas tree down at the store. And when they finally bought a new Christmas tree, I dragged the Christmas tree home. I decorated the Christmas tree. I got the money. I bought the presents for everybody and I wrapped them. Now, I do remember when I was young, I do remember Santa Claus, just visions of Santa Claus. I remember I would go to sleep in my bed and they'd tell me, sleep, 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 Santa Claus is coming. And I'd stay up and stay up and stay up. And I actually had delusions of hearing bells ringing and Santa's sleigh going over the house and coming down the chimney. But those were my delusions. I just knew that Santa had come. But in the later years, I bought all the presents. I decorated the fireplace, etc., etc. It was fun for me.
I can remember the silver tree. The tree was silver, and that's the original one that came from my dad's store, if I'm not mistaken. But I do remember a couple of the real trees. We did have a couple of real trees because I remember I had a couple of those in the house. And then I can remember, oh, my brother and I, we'd look out the doorway. When they closed the door to the kitchen, we'd sneak our head through there and look at my sister and my mom wrapping presents on the dining room table. Everything we had was always the same paper because my dad had bolts and bolts of that same paper we used for Christmas wrap at the store, if you remember that. And it was the same paper for everything. But now I can also remember my brother and I, we'd sneak in and open up some of those presents and play with them and then put them back in the box without anybody ever knowing. I can remember those little dogs with the little bells in their tails. They had a plaid, one of them was brown. They're both brown dogs, and both of them had two different colors. One of them was a green plaid, one of them was a brown plaid. They wore, and that was we'd take those out and play with it, and then tape the box back up. I can remember that. It was always fun around our house. You never knew what would show up on Christmas Day because the presents would be, first of all, they'd be real close to the tree, and by the time we got to Christmas Day, they'd be sticking out in the living room a ways. Yeah, I can remember having a little fun doing all that. That was fun back in the day. I can remember some of the toys back in those days. Toys of which they wouldn't let you play with today. They were all made out of steel. So we had this, let's see, we had the big red gasoline truck. We had some graders and some other types of things. I remember that the first time we got our bicycles, and it was snowing outside. We rode our bicycles outside. We were wrecking them all the way down the street, hitting the walls, but we were out there riding our bicycles.
What was your favorite toy? Do you remember favorite thing that you got for Christmas?
I was always excited. I don't remember that any one particular item was more exciting than another. It was just fun to get a Christmas presents and fun to open them up and fun to enjoy the time and fun to enjoy and share with the rest of the family.
How many people usually did you guys have over for Christmas or for that time of year? Who all came over? Who all were you with, and what kind of things were you guys doing besides, playing with toys and things like that?
I think the only ones that ever came over that I can remember was Grandma and Grandpa. That was probably about it. And then there was Barbara and myself and Rick and Mom and Dad. That was pretty much everybody that came over at that time of year. We used to have years ago, and I don't remember getting together, but our uncle used to live down the street. But I don't think we ever got together at Christmas because they moved when we were very young. They moved to Houston, Texas. That would be Uncle Leon and his family. And then all the rest of the family, really, there were not really anybody around at that particular time. Most of them were somewhere else. So it was just Grandma and Grandpa and just us. That was pretty much what we had for our family at that time. Everybody else was from out of town.
Any particular toys that you liked from when you were a little girl?
Well, I got dolls. And my favorite thing to do with dolls was to take them apart. And at the time that I got dolls, the arms and legs would come off if you could figure out how to take them apart. I do remember, and it's a very fond memory, I seem to remember that I liked to play with Rick and Ron's toys. All the building blocks and the erector sets and the Legos and little wooden houses that you could build. Those were a lot of fun, and I enjoyed doing that. I think, more so really than playing with the dolls.
Anything different as far as Thanksgiving? Like for Thanksgiving, what you guys would do, was it pretty much traditional, or was there anything different from Thanksgiving than what we might do today with the family?
I think there were no football games on TV. That was not a tradition during Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving was basically it's a meal and it's giving thanks. And I remember we had turkey and dressing and cranberry sauce and sweet potatoes and all the good things that you have for Thanksgiving. I remember helping to make it all, but I think everybody ate, enjoyed themselves, got together, enjoyed the day off, because in those days people worked a lot longer hours than they do right now. So that's what we did, got together and enjoyed the day without the sports being part of it.
What about the other holidays? Was it really Thanksgiving and Christmas? Were they the biggest holidays for the family? Was that the one where more people got together, or considered the biggest for you guys?
The one holiday that I remember specifically was Passover, and getting together at Grandma's house and having Passover. For Grandma and Grandpa, that seemed to be a big holiday, and Grandma would cook. I remember Grandma's mandel bread. That was quite delicious. And we had, all of the things for the Passover dinner. And Grandma's soup was extraordinarily delicious. And we had, of course, matzah and gefilte fish and all of those things. That was probably a bigger celebration because we had probably more guests in attendance than perhaps the Christmas quote celebration.
Was it typically in Joplin most of the time for the all the holidays, or did you guys go to Chicago much at all?
No traveling. I do not. Most of our traveling took place in the summer. I do not remember any traveling taking place in the fall.
Grandma did it all. She cooked from scratch. She did everything. She made chicken liver. She make everything that Grandma made was chopped liver, special. Everything was special for her. I didn't mean chicken liver, but chopped liver. But everything she did was like special because she did it all from scratch, and she made sure it was all there. And Grandma and Grandpa were, they were Orthodox. Grandpa was Orthodox, and Grandpa would read from the Haggadah, and we went through the whole Passover ceremony, and Grandpa would read, and we'd pass the book around, and everybody would read at the table. And we, of course, and obviously we went to Sunday school, Barbara and Rick and I, all three, and we all were confirmed and graduated from our going to temple every week. And so from all that, we all knew a little bit about reading a little Hebrew, not a lot. I mean, none of us were like you were, like you went to your bar mitzvah, but we didn't have one. But still, yet it was fun because we all enjoyed each other, and we were all able to have. And I say enjoy it. You got to realize we were little at the time, and being little and sitting in the same seat for quite a long time, and having to sit there and go through a meal that could be a little bit trying. But we enjoyed it. To iterate and go back, I had to remember when Barbara was saying something about those toys and stuff, and I remember the Rector set and the Lincoln Logs. And one thing about Barbara and Rick and I, we could take a box and put a strap on it and pull each other around the house and make as good of a toy out of that as we could of some of our toys. But we always had fun running around. Always managed to do things that probably we weren't supposed to. I can remember breaking the window in the front door about 350 times, not quite, but many times go right through the front door because my brother and I would both stick our hands right through the glass in the door. You remember that, Barbara? No, you don't remember that? That was on the old screened-in porch, if you remember that. But, yeah, we all enjoyed each other. We had fun. Back in those days, I guess you could look at things that we do today with toys and stuff is so much different because now it's got to be something that you got to go buy and purchase. We could make stuff out of nothing sometimes and have just as much fun. But those were the couple of things that she mentioned were pretty outstanding. I enjoyed those a lot. Matter of fact, I wish I had them today. The Lincoln Logs would be fun to have. The old set of Lincoln Logs would be fun to have. The old Rector set. Those are probably the two items we probably use constantly. Oh, and then something else we used to do a lot of. We used to put together puzzles a lot. We were big puzzle people. Jigsaw puzzles. We had all the time, always putting them together on the dining room table. We'd put 3 or 4 together on the dining room table, and we'd tear them all apart, then we'd put them back together again. So we were always doing that. Barbara would do it, Rick would do it, I would do it. We were all pretty good at that. Matter of fact, since then, all of a sudden I got involved and I like doing jigsaw puzzles again. So I got a couple at the house I've been working on.
There was no other kids besides you two and Barbara? The Rick, Rod, and Barbara were the only kids usually?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, our cousins had moved away and anybody else, neighbors and such, but we just played outside. In those days, you played outside. You didn't come in the house and you didn't make a big deal playing inside. Everything you did, you'd go out in the morning. If it was nice out and you'd stay outside all day, Mother would call you in and yell at you for lunch. You'd go back inside, then you go right back outside again. We never stayed inside the house. Pretty much in those days, it was just a natural thing to do. You go to the neighbor's house and play. You go down the street and play, across the alley, wherever it was.
I'm going to talk about your parents next, and let's talk about Florence first. And if you hadn't met Florence and you were to describe what she was like to somebody that had never met her, how do you describe your mother, personality, and what was she like?
She was like the Queen of England. She was royal. She stood up very straight. She never walked outside that her hair wasn't fixed. She never went to the grocery store without being fully coiffed and dressed and made up and looking wonderful. She was kind of regal and prim and proper, and I really don't think she fit in Joplin, Missouri.
Yeah, you said you really didn't think that she in a lot of ways would have rather lived in a more cosmopolitan city. She would have wanted to live in the city, so it was difficult for her, you think, at times, just living in Joplin.
She liked art, she liked history, she liked music and singing and dancing and in a more professional style. And I don't think that particularly fit in the small town atmosphere that we resided in. It was more good old boy atmosphere, and she just wasn't a good old girl.
Oh, I think the fun part about Mom was she could sit down and play the piano. She'd sit there and sometimes she'd sit there and sing for, maybe, I don't know, an hour or so or whatever. She wasn't wanting to go sit down and watch TV. She wasn't wanting to go sit down and read the newspaper that much. She when she did stuff, she did stuff around the house, and whatever Mom did, it was like she made the effort to be whatever it was. She liked the sisterhood. I think I remember that. She enjoyed doing that, don't you think, quite a bit. And she enjoyed friends and company of in Joplin, there wasn't that many people that she had to move into a community that she knew nobody because Dad was from there. But then she had to remember her thing was more like getting to know others. She had friends and she did things, but I think Dad did more with other people than Mom did, but Mom was with Dad, so she did them because Dad did them, not because Mom did them. So pretty much, I would say, in respect to that.
What was your dad like? He was working a lot, from what I understand. What was his personality away from work, and was it even different when he was at work?
Well, I think maybe the twins' idea and my idea of Dad were different. But to me, Dad was a good old boy. He had lots and lots of friends. He told stories, and the stories were funny. He would make us laugh. I can't say that Mom would make us laugh. I just remember Dad's stories would make us laugh at the dinner table or any place else that he told them. Dad was well liked by the person with the highest income in Joplin down to the person with the lowest income. He was generous. If his employee, who was a truck driver, was having babies, he'd send him to the hospital. He'd pay for the hospital bill. He'd buy him baby clothes. He did all kinds of things, and he was genuine in his generosity. He was a good person. Worked hard, but he was a good person.
Dad was a very hard worker. Dad, he'd leave in the house early in the morning. He'd go to work, and he'd be gone all day. He'd work on Saturdays. He worked on Sundays. I can remember Rick and I would go down, and we'd play in the store while Dad would go do the books on Sunday or whatever. One thing about Dad, he was always business. Barbara remembers more a funny side at times, but he enjoyed the people he was with. He had a lot of fun with the guys that come over and have card games at the house. They'd sit around, smoke cigars, and have a good time. And then, one thing about, we had more than one place. We had the furniture and TV store, and we also had the clothing store. So they had more than one thing going at one time, plus other things they had in business and shared with his brothers, other types of businesses together, or other things together in real estate and such as that. So, and with Grandpa too. So there was always something going along, and Dad was spent a lot of time with Grandpa. Grandpa and Dad were very close together as to how they created and did things together business wise. I mean, I think they were like, besides being dad and son, I think they were more like good buddies as to how they did some of their stuff together. And I think they played off each other quite a bit as to how, their business and life was conducted. And Dad and Grandpa did a lot of conversation together because they were always around each other, whereas the other brothers in the family weren't around as much.
Is there anything that you remember you learned from your dad?
Having lost Dad in such an early time of life, it's so difficult to remember those types of things, only because I think you rebel more as what your parents tell you to do than you try to do as a person, to try and be, like, oh, my dad's my friend, or my dad's my dad, and I really enjoy this or that. Not really, because I don't feel like we had the time to really get to know my father, because we were in school the whole time. We spent 12 years in regular school, and then we went to college, and then when you turn around, Dad's gone. So to know Dad, I think that some of the memories I remember, you could, as I think the vacations, I think those were fun to do with the mom and Dad. Of course, we did, we went on horseback riding. I remember that. We used to go, on weekends, a lot of times we used to go down to a place, what was the name of that barber down there, where we went to Sagamont Pool, I think it was, south of John. Yeah, and we'd go enjoy each other. We'd all sit around and have a picnic, and we'd sit around and go swimming, and Mom always told us, you can't swim until after an hour. You got to sit out, and while you're eating, after you eat, you can't go swimming, give you a stomach ache. I mean, Dad was fun to be around when the time was there. A lot of times Dad was gone and he was working. A lot of times, maybe on Sunday you'd see Dad, and then he would go to work at noon. And, his store was open from noon to 5 on Sunday too. They were worked 7 days a week back in those days. And then I can remember we'd go out and eat, and there was some, I always enjoyed going out to Wilder's to eat. We'd go over to the Connor Hotel and eat, and we'd go to Robert's Cafeteria and eat, and those were maybe, once in a while we'd go to Henry Chin's and eat, remember Henry's Fine Foods and eat. So those were some, Dad always took us out for good food, I can say that. We always had a nice meal together as a family when we went out. It was always fun to do. Once in a while, Keller's barbecue, not very often, but I mean, some of the things we did like that was fun. And vacations were fun, and it wasn't always fun to go to Chicago, because we seemed like we go to Chicago, we always get in trouble with Grandma and Grandpa. Grandma up there, she'd always get us in trouble. She didn't like us touching her furniture, didn't like us walking on the carpet, but it was sort of fun to go visit. And if we broke anything or did anything wrong, we sure didn't tell anybody. But we had fun. Barbara would babysit us when we'd go to the place, if I'm not mistaken, I can't remember, was it the Avenue Motel, or what the heck was it? Somewhere we stayed. The Patio Motel is what it was. And we'd go over there, and our cousin would come over there, and we'd eat. And I remember one time Barbara and my cousin put a pizza in the oven, burned it, so we opened the front door and the back door, and we're trying to blow the smoke out of the place because they burnt the pizza that time. So, but I mean, but there's little things. We always enjoyed having fun. Of course, back in those days when you traveled, it was a 2-lane road. There was no 4-lane road. And Dad would never let Mom drive, because Mom wasn't that good of a driver when it came down to driving on the highway. So the few times he let Mom drive, she could find the gas, but I don't know if she knew how to hit the brake. She was a little speedster Mom, didn't know how to drive on the highway too good. You remember that, or no?
What do you remember? Was there anything that learning from your dad or your mom, and stuff that you think about today that you learned from just being around them, or even stuff that they told you?
Hopefully I remembered from my mom how to put myself together, which I hope that I kind of still do, because sometimes I think, if I don't get my hair done and put on nice clothes when I go to the grocery store, oh, what would Mom think? But that's just the way I was my whole life. And Dad, I think I just I think I learned how to leverage people, deal with people. Dad always tried to be fair. I think I hopefully learned the fairness of doing things in the best way that I possibly could.
Ron mentioned some of the vacations. What do you remember most about the vacations? Some of the ones that you took, and best memories from that time.
The only vacations that I remember were vacations to Chicago, which I think Ron hit upon quite well. And it was fun going to Lake Michigan, which we went to several times. Other times we went to visit Chicago. I did take a trip with Mom and Dad to Mexico one time, which was lovely. A beach trip. That's where I learned how to play ping pong, was at the beach. We ate pistachio nuts at the beach. We used to put in a penny, and there'd be probably 30 red pistachio nuts that would come out of the machine. That was so much fun, getting all those pistachio nuts, because we could not get them in Missouri where I was from, and they were so, so cheap. I remember Mom had a really bad temper and would yell and do things sometimes, but sometimes when the twins would do things, I would expect her to go berserk and bananas yelling. But I think the big thing that I remember, but one of the biggest things I remember about the twins was a food fight we had at the kitchen table one time. And we were all sitting there at the kitchen table, and everybody had their sandwich and their jello and whatever, and Mother was maybe soup or whatever Mother was. It was a lunchtime, maybe on a weekend. And maybe the twins were 3 or maybe they were 5, but they would get mad at each other. And I remember they got mad at each other and they started throwing jello at each other. And the jello was hitting the walls. Splat, splat, splat. I could do nothing but laugh, and I thought Mother was going to go berserk bananas and start yelling and screaming, but all that we could all do is laugh because the jello was splatting all over the kitchen walls, the kitchen tables. It looked like a movie.
Talked about when the twins were born. What were they like when they were little? What do you remember about them being born and how they were when they were really small?
Well, I remember we had the most wonderful babysitter, Vivian, who came in, and she was there for several months when the twins were born. I'm sure the twins don't remember, but she was the most wonderful person in the world. They did not come home together. Rick came home first because he was the heavier, and Ron had to stay in the hospital a little bit longer because he had to get up to a certain weight to come home. I mean, I just remember the volumes of diapers and bottles and food and crying. And I remember my father wanted to feed them one time, and he fed the same one. We had, as I recall, we had one high chair. He put one in the high chair, fed him. He put the same one back in the high chair and tried to feed him again. They were really hard to tell apart when they were small. As they got older, they became easier to tell apart. I could not tell them apart when they had their eyes closed, but when they had their eyes open, I could tell them apart. It was difficult.
What do you remember about your sister and growing up with her, and what your relationship with your sister was?
And realizing her being 6 years older, so anything we did she was already past whatever stage that she's already passed it. So my beginning memories would probably be when I was in grade school. And probably, I can remember when I was in 6th grade, she'd come pick us up and she'd drive us over to the high school and we'd watch her practice for a play. This would be because Mom and Dad are out of town. And I can remember her driving us, like we'd maybe go to the store once in a while. But I mean, most of the time Barbara had her own group, her own people, her own friends. When Barbara was home and we did anything together, it was pretty much most of the time it was be around the dinner table or stuff like that. Now, if she was in her room, I mean, she was either sleeping or doing homework or, that was it. I mean, it wasn't, because when we got to when we were like 4th or 5th grade already, she's already in high school. So, I mean, she had her own little things going on all the time. We were not in the mix of pretty much what she did. Now, like I said, we went to the plays. I watched her practice. I probably watched if I can remember this one, was it The Taming of the Shrew? Maybe that was the one of them. And or no, it was one of them. I can't remember whatever it was, but I remember went to a lot of practices for that one, whatever it was. But I mean, and then when I remember when boom, she was out of high school. I remember that when she graduated, and poof, she was off to college to the University of Illinois. Stayed a year there, and then she went to the University of Missouri, and then she joined the sorority. I mean, I remember all those things, but I mean, after that, when she left, I mean, you're close with your sister, but you're not part of what she does on a regular basis because you don't see her, so you're not that close. I mean, that's just because you've got that big of an age difference. So you pretty much when you grew up, it was like she was gone before you turned around, pretty much. So as we got older and we were and such as that, we would go to the store and work with Dad. I mean, I could remember when I was a little kid going to get shoes out of the back room at the ready-to-wear store we had. I can remember doing that. I can remember going to the furniture store and putting stuff together. I remember being able to, work on washers and dryers. I could, we were at the store. We probably spent more time at Dad's store doing that than we did playing with friends, probably, as we grew up and got a little older and older. I'm not saying older. It could be 8, 9, 10, 11 years old. We were doing things all the time. We'd always be hanging around the store doing something. So we were ring the cash register when we were little. I can remember doing that. I remember Dad taught us pretty much everything in the store, things that we could do, not necessarily things that we would do on a regular basis, but just being around with other people. And I mean, we knew pretty much what was going on with being able to be, with Dad. And, but then when you look at it, Mom was at home. She was a stay-at-home mom. Mom didn't work until she got older. And when we were in high school, maybe I think she started working, if I'm not mistaken. She started going in the store and working pretty much, on a regular basis, not all day, but that's when she really started taking more interest in the business.
I guess everybody knows twins are different relationship maybe than normal siblings would have. What do you think that was maybe something that people don't think about when you have a twin? What's kind of different about the relationship or different about your relationship with Rick?
There's times we think alike and not knowing each other or thinking the same thing. There's times we've dressed alike, not even knowing that we had the same type of shirt on. I mean, sometimes I think we can amaze our own selves based on things, just generalities, nothing special. I mean, I think when you grow up with somebody that is the same age as you are and the same person, it makes a big. I think you're more in tune to that's what it is. You don't think so much about what the differences are or what's why you're that close and I don't. Obviously, a lot of people don't get to ever see that because I'm talking about others being you being having a sister of a younger age and then Barbara having brothers that are 6 years younger. I mean, I guess I see it as just being us, really, more than anything else. We're, our personalities are somewhat different, and then somewhat they're alike. I mean, we talk every day, twice a week, 3 times a week, 4 times a week. So, we're always have a conversation. They're not long conversations, but just a hello and what's going on and what are you doing and such as that. So we're close, but I don't think that it's like. I don't feel the difference like some people because you're twins. There should be something very, unique about it. Yeah, there is, but because you are that, you don't think about it that much. I don't think.
Was it ever frustrating? Would you say it was frustrating to be sometimes considered the same entity? Somebody would say the twins instead of saying Ron or Rick, or you were considered less individual, or did that kind of thing bother you when you were younger?
That's all we ever heard. The twins never heard Rick and Ron. Rick and Ron was an odd name. No, they always said, "Oh, there's the twins." They would say, "Oh, look at the twins." Even when we were 50 years old walking to the Mall of America, I can remember walking up. Some lady walked up and said, "Are you twins?" I think she wasn't a lady. It was probably some younger kids. Oh, never seen older twins before. So that's sort of funny. Now, I guess growing up as a twin is its own thing. And it's unique because there's not millions and millions of twins running around. So I consider it as a privilege to have a brother and have a twin. I don't overthink it by no means. But, I mean, I've always enjoyed it to the fact being, people say, do you have younger brothers or older sister? I mean, do you have any other siblings? You say older sister, and I have a brother, and I'm a twin. So when you say you're a twin, they look at you and their eyes sparkle, and they go, oh, wow, you're a twin. Yeah, I'm a twin. So, I mean, but I guess because you are, you don't think about it as much as if you weren't, and then other people think about it more. So.
You mentioned a little bit about your grandparents. Talk a little bit about. Well, I'll start off with the Cohen side. What were they like? What were your grandparents like? What do you remember?
Grandpa Cohen was the easiest guy in the world you ever wanted to get along with. Grandpa was always fun to be around. You could do something with Grandpa. You could go out and mow the grass with him. You could talk to Grandpa. Grandma was a tough one. Grandma, she was a toughie. Grandma Cohen and my mother, they were from the same mold, I guarantee you. My grandmother, she wasn't fun to be around. How do I say? I don't want to say she's not fun, but she wasn't fun. My grandmother was strictly everything was by whatever it was. And everything that Grandma did or didn't do was basically how it was going to be no matter what. She laid the law down. That was the rule, and that's what it was. When you went around, actually, she'd scare us, to be honest. She was scary. She'd be scary to be around. Not for real, but it wasn't anybody you're going to go have fun with. I mean, even my Uncle High, which was my Aunt Shirley's husband, he tried to have some fun, and Grandma, and when we were there, he'd have fun with us, tried to, and Grandma would get so mad. One time he came in and said, "You got B-boys know how to play 52 pickup?" "No, we don't know it. We're just little kids." So he threw all the cards on the floor, and here comes Grandma in the kitchen. She sees all these cards on there, and she started, "What in the hell are you doing?" She always had these, the way she talked, she's very pointed in how she did her thing and how she'd say something. It wasn't like, "Oh, I love to see," and all that. It was pretty much, it was just a little different, that's all. I mean, Grandma had her own way of doing things. So,
What do you remember of the Cohens, the grandparents?
Okay, I remember Grandma Cohen's big mouth, which was probably bigger than my mother, because Mother at least had a bit of a soft side sometimes. I don't remember Grandma Cohen's soft side. Hate to say it, but don't remember it. Grandpa seemed to be a nice guy, drove like a crazy person, but other than that, he seemed to be a nice guy, and for some reason, he put up with Grandma, and she would yell at him all the time. She wasn't happy unless she was yelling at somebody. "Get your fingers off. This is too dirty. This is too this, too that. You need to pick this up." I guess maybe she was a bit of obsessive compulsive disorder, and I think a little wore off on Mother because Mother had felt like she had to dust and vacuum every day.
What did they do? What kind of things did they do for their job? And then what was the type of thing that they did for fun? I know you've talked about a little bit about that they were very musically inclined.
They were very musically inclined, but they did, as far as I'm concerned, I rarely saw any musical inclination, and when I did, it really shocked me. Grandma Cohen, during the time that I knew her, worked for Dun & Bradstreet, and Grandpa had a business with his brothers, the coat manufacturing business. And after it went belly up in the 1929 landslide, after a few years, he went to work for Sears, and he stayed there until he retired. Now, what he did at Sears, I don't know.
What about your grandparents on the Bormaster side? Tell me a little bit about what they were like personality-wise.
I would say Grandpa was a nice guy, but you never thought you could connect with him. He wasn't really interested in connecting with the grandchildren very much. He was a figure of authority, but I don't remember him disliking of us. I just remember him being remote. And Grandma was, we were our grandma's little children. Grandma just loved us to death. That's what I can remember. She was very kind and loving and nurturing, and she would want to play with us and cook for us and do stuff for us. Very nice grandmother.
Now, Grandpa did something with us boys that we did quite a bit. We always played gin rummy. Played a lot of gin rummy at Grandpa's house. He loved to play gin rummy. And I can remember going down to Grandpa's office, and I can remember going over to when Grandpa would go over and fix something in one of the apartments. He'd take his little tools over there and try and fix something. Grandpa was never one to want to call someone to fix something. He wanted to try and do it himself first. Everything. And, Grandpa had a lot of apartments and a lot of places that he, had that were older and they needed repair on a regular basis. And I'd walk over with him to one of the places. I guess Rick and I probably spent a lot of time with Grandma and Grandpa. We'd go over there all the time. We just walked down there. They only lived a half a block from us. Just go down the alley and go over to their place. He was right down the street, so we go in over there all the time. And one thing about Grandpa, Grandpa never drove. Never drove a car in his life. Grandma drove him everywhere. Grandpa did a lot of walking. He loved to walk. And Grandpa, rarely did you see Grandpa. Maybe on Sunday did you not see him wearing a tie. He always had a tie and a coat on. Grandpa would always wear a tie and a coat and a hat everywhere he went. Maybe on Sunday he'd wear a pair of slacks and a shirt, but he always had a coat and a tie on, usually 6 days a week.
What do you remember about where they came from, the story of them ending up in Joplin? What did they tell you about that?
Grandpa Morris, his parents went there before Grandpa and Grandma went to Joplin. So how his parents went there, I really don't know. But Grandpa remained behind in Lublin, Poland to apparently marry my grandmother, and they came over maybe a year later. I really don't know. I guess I really should have written it down, but I really don't know. I know they all came through Galveston, and I know that they were from Lublin, Poland.
And they moved to Joplin because they knew somebody in Joplin. Is that right?
That would be my idea, but this was Morris's parents rather than Morris and Sarah, so that connection was never discussed that much unless you heard something about it. Okay, my grandmother and grandfather Cohen in Chicago moved. They were both born in Chicago. Their parents came here. Again, don't know much about it because not a great deal was discussed.
What country were they were from?
Russia.
Just want to ask you about what you remember, because you said you remember the end of World War II. You remember the VE Day. You remember that happening. What do you remember about that from when you were really little?
First of all, it was my birthday. I don't even know if I remember or if I remember people telling me about it, but it was my birthday, and of course, everybody was out in the streets yelling and screaming. I was in Chicago at the time, staying with my grandparents while my father was in the Army. They were at the time rationing ice cream, and I remember that we could have ice cream for my birthday. And that's what I remember about VE Day, is it being my birthday and people out in the streets yelling and screaming and shouting.
There was more radio than television when you were growing up. Do you remember what type of stuff that you would listen to on the radio? What shows, what music, what sports? What would you guys listen at home on the radio to?
Baseball was a big deal because Dad liked to listen to baseball. He would sit around. We had this, and I can't remember the radio, but it was in the living room. And so you could huddle around the radio. It was a big old radio. Yep. Be worth a lot of money today if we had it. And so we'd sit around and listen to the radio. And then when my era would come along, I'd have to think TV was just beginning to come along. And I can remember the little TV that was up, a little round one like this with two little knobs on it. And we'd pick up different stations on TV, but Dad's big fling, he always liked to watch the fights on Friday night. It was a big deal. He'd sit back in his armchair in his T-shirt and sit there and watch the fights on Friday night. You remember that, Barbara?
Mom, what do you remember about anything that you listened to on the radio? I know you used to tell me that you remember listening to Harry Carey and the St. Louis Cardinals games.
Harry Carey and the St. Louis Cardinals. The Shadow. I'd sit there and listen to The Shadow and Joe Friday. Dragnet. Always listen to Dragnet on the radio. And I remember sitting over by the radio, all huddled up and listening to those shows.
What about music? Do you guys remember any music from that time in the 40s and the 50s that you would listen to? What was it, Bing Crosby, or what were some of the musicians, or what type of music? Did you listen to music in the house? Did your father play music?
My mother played the piano by ear and sang, and we had a record player that played 78 records, and most of what we listened to was Broadway show music. Let's see, she would play things that she sang to, such as Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend, The Very Thought of You. My father used to play the violin. So did I, but he was about 50 times better than I was. He was really good at playing the violin.
What do you remember, Ron, about that? Do you remember some of the stuff that they would play around the house?
You know, I can remember us as kids sitting there in the living room. Mom sat there and play on the piano, and I could remember. Now, Dad never played the violin that I remember when I was growing up. Barbara would remember more about that because probably back a few years earlier than that, he probably did, but not when we were around. I mean, like, I don't remember him playing, but I do remember distinctly Mother would always sit there, and her big deal was to sit there and just vocalize and play the piano, and she could do that for hours on end. She'd sit there and play the piano, and then she did, if I'm not mistaken, did she not do some stuff at the temple and play there?
Any play that was around town, she would play and sing. As I told my students, she had a connection with the audience like no other. When they do The Voice and all the shows and everything, part of it is your connection with the audience. And she connected. She had every right move that when she was on stage, and she had what I call an Ethel Merman voice.
So what about television? I remember, Mom, you said that you remember getting your first color television and the neighbors getting the first color TV, that sort of thing.
First of all, my father was in the business of the television, so we had the television store in the city. I mean, I remember the first color show that we ever watched was The Wizard of Oz. One of the things that Ron didn't mention to you about TV is we were getting most of our TV from Kansas City and Tulsa, which were 100 miles and 165 miles away. So a lot of what we were able to get had a lot of snow, and you had to have the aerial on the roof in order to get it, and some days it was decent and other days it wasn't. But most of things that we saw were, I guess probably even as time went by, the Howdy Doody Show, Captain Kangaroo, all the cowboy shows, the Lone Ranger, Gene Autry, and Dale Evans, Hopalong Cassidy. There were a lot of those types of shows on. And of course, as time went on, of course, we watched the Ed Sullivan Show and some of the other shows that, the variety shows that came upon us.
Ron, what do you remember about the early shows that you watched and that time of getting color TV and just some of the stuff that you watched even before that?
Okay, I'll go back to the color TV, and if I'm not mistaken, when Barbara said we saw The Wizard of Oz in color, what it was a plastic screen that you put over the TV, and you could watch The Wizard of Oz in color. But I do remember that, but I don't remember the year. See, the original Wizard of Oz was not in color, it was black and white. So they had to remake it to make it in color because it was not originally in color. But they did, I can't remember when the year that was. On Saturday morning, we always used to watch. Probably there was cartoons, but on Saturday morning in our era, we actually had good shows that are half hours long, like Fury was one of them. You could watch. There was one with Sky King on there, the Songbird. They had the plane. Do you remember that one, Barbara? And then, of course, obviously, when she said Gene Autry, then you had Roy Rogers and Trigger and Dale Evans and all that on Saturday morning. So there was a variety of shows every Saturday morning that you could watch. And even in the evening times, back in the day, there was more westerns on than there was anything else. You had Gunsmoke, and you had Bat Masterson, and you had Wyatt Earp. All these ones that you probably could, the names today you remember, but they back in the day, Hopalong Cassidy. So a lot of westerns.
Do you remember any of the variety shows from the earlier days? Do you remember Milton Berle or Your Show of Shows?
Wasn't your show of shows Ed Sullivan?
No, Your Show of Shows was Sid Caesar
I
and
remember Sid Caesar. I remember Milton Berle, Ed Sullivan, Carol Burnett, Jack Benny. Lots of variety shows. Art Linkletter. And then, of course, they began doing the soap operas on... We used to listen to the soap operas on the radio, but then they began doing the soap operas.
Remember Amos and Andy?
Amos and Andy, the Three Stooges. But, you know, they started doing the soap operas on TV then.
Ron, do you remember like your mom and dad? What were their favorite shows? Is there anything that they like to watch or they got excited about seeing?
I think they like the variety shows more than anything else. They love to watch, like she was. They liked the Ed Sullivan Show. They love to watch. I think like and those shows came on like at 6 o'clock at night. You'd have like Milton Berle and Jack Benny, all the ones that she was mentioning. I think those are some of the ones that they really liked. They really enjoyed watching. And even when you think about it, back in the day, The Tonight Show came on, and I can't remember the year, but that was back when it was, what the heck was his name? The original...
Jack Parr or before Jack Parr?
Do you remember, Barbara?
Steve Allen? Was it Steve Allen?
Okay, but before Steve, there was Steve Allen, and then there was another one, Joey Bishop. Yeah?
No, I think he was afterwards.
Was he?
Yeah.
Okay, but I remember. I mean, it's not like I stayed up and watched those, but I just remember the names and what in respects of that. But even at the news, I mean, Walter Cronkite was a big deal. You could listen to Walter on the radio before you ever saw him on the TV. We could listen to Walter Cronkite, and a lot of the things that we remember from news, you got your news on the radio. You never, because back in the day, we didn't have news on television when they first started. Everything came from the radio. If you remember, some of the variety things that I also remember was the fact that, like in the middle of the afternoon when you came home from school, you could watch. They had a show on back when they started the TV channel 12. They'd have a little a type of deal like the guy was on TV, and then they had like a western to go along with it, and you probably don't remember anything like that. But they had some They had at noon. They had variety shows, and then you had Captain Kangaroo early in the morning that used to be on there with Mr. Green Jeans every morning at 7 or 8 o'clock. I mean, those are the types of things we grew up. So it was you always remember the show because every day was going to be on every 5 days a week. So.
Mom, do you remember any of the movies that you went to see when you were a kid? Anything that stuck out?
Doris Day, Doris Day, Doris Day, and Doris Day.
You remember which Doris Day movies that, was it Please Don't Eat the Daisies?
Not anything specific. It was just one Doris Day movie after the next.
What about you, Ron? Do you remember any movies that you were excited about as a kid getting your first chance to get to go see?
No, I just remember the theaters more than I do the movies. Because, see, back in those days, we could go walk downtown and walk to our dad's store, and we'd go over to see the Fox Theater, which is a block down the street, the Lux Theater just right across the street, and the Paramount Theater. All three theaters within 2 blocks of the dad's store, so we could go down and see a movie or whatever. And nowadays, you wouldn't let your kids go see them by themselves, but I think Barbara used to take us to the movies, if I'm not mistaken. Didn't she, once or twice? Or how did we get to the movies? Maybe we went by ourselves, or somebody took us.
Well, let me ask you about just things that you might remember as far as, history and big moments in history. For most people, one of the biggest moments, Mom, and this would have been when you were in college, I think, was the assassination of the president, Kennedy. What do you remember about that happening and where you were and just anything that you can remember from that?
I was in my red Chevrolet going to the photographer, getting ready to have my picture taken for the university yearbook. And on the radio in the car, I hear that the president has been shot. I go to have my picture taken, and by the time that is over, which involved probably being there for an hour or two because there were other people and you had to wait. And by the time I got back in my car, the president was dead. I do remember that, and I do remember watching in my university where I lived the black and white coverage, because I think we had a black and white TV. I do not remember a colored TV in that particular residence where we lived, of the train going from wherever it went to Washington, D.C., and it seemed to go on forever. And I remember the utter sadness of everybody on the campus and everybody I knew. And that's just the way it was during that time period.
So I think, Ron, you would have been maybe about 15 years old, 1963. You would have been in high school. So what do you remember about that?
I can remember, I was sitting on the front row, if I'm not mistaken. I was on the second floor in Joplin High School. And it was either history class or something of that nature. I can see the teacher just as I'm sitting here today, and I can't tell you his name just exactly. And when I was sitting there, I remember it came over the intercom. They had to come over the intercom that the president had been shot. Now, from that's probably pretty much my major memory of that coming across the intercom from that particular time.
Let me ask you this about the Beatles on Ed Sullivan. Do you remember when the Beatles first appeared on Ed Sullivan?
I do remember their appearance. I watched it, but I don't remember. I mean, I don't remember exactly when it was. I do remember them being on Ed Sullivan. I was never a person who worshipped musicians. I would watch them, but I didn't worship them or go crazy or insane over them, ever. But I do remember their first appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show.
You remember any of this, Ron, the Beatles or even Elvis Presley? Because you said that your parents both were big fans of Ed Sullivan and those type of shows.
I know they watch the shows, but, of course, I do remember the Ed Sullivan Show, and I do remember having Elvis Presley. I remember him being on the show. But you got to realize, back in those days, the person that being on the Ed Sullivan Show was a big deal. But just because it was Elvis Presley, in our era, it was Elvis Presley. In today's era, it's more meaningful because of who he is and what he's done, what he was. Now, the Beatles, when they first came, I can remember them walking down the stairs of the plane, and I remember all the people going rah-rah and all the other stuff. I remember all that, and I remember when they got on there and when the Beatles first played, I can remember watching it on TV. But really, that's about it. I've never been a big concert person or what band was this or that, but I remember it.
It was obviously a huge deal in the United States at the time, and then also a lot of different stuff in the 60s. What do you remember about that, Mom? Because it seemed, as we look back on it, there was all these big historical events, the civil rights movement, the Martin Luther King assassination, the war in Vietnam, the protest involving that. Anything from that era that just that you remember very well that sticks out for you?
One more thing about the Beatles and Elvis Presley and their tremendous fan base. I wasn't into that hero worship of those musicians. That was just not our style. It seems funny, to listen to. You asked about Martin Luther King. That was just Martin Luther King. I mean, we watched it, et cetera, and we digested it. As far as Vietnam is concerned, the concern with Vietnam was people going to war, and of course Rick and Ron were drafted into the service. Everybody went to war by the numbers game. When you became 18, you had a number that you were given, and if you were a low number, you had to go to the Army. I remember that because of Rick and Ron and because of my husband. As far as wars are concerned, I've never been pro-war, and that's just the way it is.
What do you remember about all that, Ron? Because you had to be thinking about, in terms of, not just the fact what was going on in the country, but how this would affect you, how you might get drafted. Is that something that you were thinking about or worried about, or you remember you and your brother worrying about?
It was not so much the worry as it was the fact that, If you stayed in college, you wouldn't get drafted. But I laid out one semester, and as soon as I laid out one semester, they had me, and it was February '69. I didn't really go until August of 1969, and that's my first day in the Army was August 21st, if I'm not mistaken, 1969. So I think the biggest thing about that was everything when I was in the service, it was all about everything you ever heard or everything they ever said to you was when you get to Vietnam, and that's the whole nature of what they tried to instill in you as you went through the basic and AIT of the Army when I was in there. So.
Do you see protests of people your own age? Were the kids that you knew talking about what was going on? Were they felt like this was something that was not right, what was happening, or did they have a thought on any of that stuff?
I don't remember anything. I mean, I could see protests on TV, and I could see those things, but in my own inner circle, no, I never saw anybody really protest the war in my inner circle. The biggest thing in what I did was when I was in the service, I got to say I was lucky because when I went to AIT and in one of the classes in one side of the building, everybody went to Vietnam. In the class that I was in on the other side of the building, we all went to Korea. So I ended up spending my whole Army career after my AIT in Seoul, South Korea.
Tell me what AIT is again.
Advanced Individual Training.
So, Mom, did you know the kids that were protesting, or that at the University of Missouri, or was it anything like that happening, or would that all happen maybe after you left college?
Number one, it all happened after I graduated college. Number two, when we're talking about Rick and Ron and war and Army and all that kind of stuff, our father had been ill and had died recently, and I think we were more involved in our father's death and all of the things that we had to do after he died that we were not into thinking that much about the war.
Let me ask you about the space movement, because the moon landing may be the biggest thing that's happened in the last 2,000 years of time as far as just major events. And what do you remember, Ron, about the moon landing, where you were, what you thought as you were watching all of that?
I was in the Army when it happened. I remember that because there was a bunch of guys sitting around. I remember us watching it on TV, and I can remember him stepping off the modular and coming down there. And I remember the words when he spoke the words coming down there, and everybody cheered and thought it was a pretty good-sized deal because of what it was at the time. I even remember when Alan Shepard made his first flight into space when I was in junior high school, if I'm not mistaken, and I can't remember if it was 7th grade or 8th grade, and I can remember we were sitting in, I think it was either, I'll call it gym class, or for lack of whatever it was at the time, and I remember when he went up into space and came back down, they had first command to go into space. And also I can remember that, speaking of which, when Barbara said our father was sick, when we were down here in Houston, and our father and mother had to have a place to live while my dad was going back and forth to the hospital, the Methodist hospital, so we were right across the street in a set of apartments, and happened to be my mother and father's neighbor right across the hallway, happened to be Alan Shepard.
Did you get a chance to meet him, or did your father get a chance to meet him?
I can remember riding up and down the elevator a couple of times with him, and that's about it.
That's correct.
Well, let me ask you, Mom, what you remember about the moon landing and just the space. And if July 20th, 1969, I'm sure people can look this up that are listening to this, but that's when man landed on the moon. I believe Alan Shepard was the first American into space, Yuri Gagarin, the first person into space, the Russian astronaut, and then John Glenn was the first person to circle the Earth. So what do you remember about man landing on the moon, Mom?
I remember seeing it on TV. I don't know that I watched it live. What I can tell you is I have a much greater memory of Apollo 13 because I watched it live, and I watched the whole thing, and that movie of Apollo 13 is gut-wrenching because I remember watching it live, and when they had Walter Cronkite on that movie and what he was saying and what he was doing, I was watching it live. And when it landed and when they were talking about the 4 minutes, I was watching it live. So that movie to me is pretty gut wrenching.
When you remember the moon landing, was it something that there was a great deal of pride as an American, as a person of the planet, that we were able to accomplish something like this? Were you thinking in those terms at that time?
Of course, but I don't think we quite realized what a feat it was. I really don't think that we realized until after the fact what a feat it was.
When you were watching it, Ron, were you thinking that was there real nervousness that what's going to happen when he tries to go out on the moon? Because this was really the first time we went on somewhere else. You didn't know, what exactly was going to happen when he stepped out of the ship, or when he got on the moon. What do you remember about that kind of feeling that you had as you watched it?
I think more of an excitement feeling because you're seeing it live on TV. But do I think that, of course, you see things in history all the time. A lot of times you don't, even though you know it's history, because of your mindset and what you're seeing, history being made, you don't think of it as that maybe at the time, but after the fact and later on in life, then you begin to put those pieces of the puzzle together because of everything else in the continuation of things back all the way from the space shuttle all the way up to where we're at today.
Mom, what about the fact that it took place in Houston, and by that point you had spent some time in Houston because of your dad? Was there a kind of connection that you had with it after knowing that your dad lived near Alan Shepard, and so you'd been to Houston, and it was something that maybe you'd connected a little bit more to if you'd just lived in Joplin your whole life at that point?
I would say probably so on one note, but on the other note, again, I think I was more involved with what was going on with family, etc., than at that particular moment in time than I may have been about the man on the moon.
What was the date that Grandpa passed away?
68, in April of 68.
Anything else that comes to mind, Ron, as you think of it?
Well, you go back and you remember the one space shuttle that blew up in the air, and it had Christy McCullough on it and other individuals that time. What was it? Allison Onizuka. He was from Hawaii, and I never personally met him. I had driven to his house before because it so happened Christy and his daughter happened to be friends, and I can remember taking his daughter to dinner one night, and as friends, I think we went to a Mexican restaurant down there in Clear Lake or in that area, and so I mean that part of the memory of something like that. And I never knew the guy, but having known the daughter the little bit of time we spent around her, so you bring those things into perspective based on the fact that you knew who the person was, and so the meaningfulness of that probably had more meaning because you had a little bit of a connection through your own families, just a little bit. I mean, not in a big way, but just in a small way. So I can remember that.
One thing I'd ask you about, Mom, is because it's so specifically has to do with the family, is Watergate. Watergate happens, an incredible event where the president resigns. What's so amazing is that the day that he resigned was the day that your daughter was born. I'm sure your mind was elsewhere at the time, but I'm wondering, do you remember hearing about the president resigning as you're going through all of this? Was it something that they were talking about in the hospital? What do you remember about Watergate and just that and running up to that day?
I don't know what I remember and what I don't remember about the fact that he resigned the day my daughter was born. I think she still has the newspaper clipping because I saved it for her. Yes, I think it was a big deal because there's hardly ever been a president that's ever resigned in my lifetime.
The only president, I believe, that has resigned. Do you remember much about that, Ron? Because you obviously were waiting for your niece, but I mean, just talk about Watergate in general. It was taking place over a couple of years, and there's the president that's been talked about recording stuff and the lies that were going on and all of that sort of stuff. The world changed the way we looked, I think, at the president of the United States.
It's probably, when you think back about and you look at those things, it's probably the beginning of the fact that we investigate everything in the government today, and that probably was the beginning of investigations that still continue today in different ways. I remember when he said he would never resign his office, then you turn around and the next time you think about saying anything of the same perspective, here he is getting on the helicopter and telling everybody goodbye, and he's leaving and he's resigned from his office. And then then the next day, you've got a new president based on the fact that the vice president became the president. So, we don't get that's other than the fact that Kennedy being shot, and other than the fact that Johnson taking over at the same time. See, those things don't happen very often. Our country stays pretty stable in that. Investigation-wise, we've got something going on all the time. So, I mean, that's just how the nature of our government works, per se, and how things go in the history of things. And so as that began, and I remember just those little tidbits, because, I've never been somebody to go sit there and gnaw on that type of thing all the time. But those things, I mean, now it's more prevalent. You see it every day. Something's going on, so it's more prevalent now. Back then, that was a big deal. Today, it's about an everyday occurrence.
Mom, is there anything, just wrapping it up, historically, is there anything that, like when you think in terms of your lifetime, that we haven't talked about, that just something that you'll never forget, something that you saw on television, you saw take place, it was in the news, anything that really sticks out to you?
9/11. What else can I say? I think it sticks out to everybody.
Anything else, Ron, that comes to your mind?
In today's world, about when you talk about different things in the history of things, I think the enlightening things that go along around the world, every day is history, because every day something happens, and every day something, if you have a memory of what it is. And as I look back, and she mentions 9/11, and I remember exactly where I was at the time. And certain things you do remember where you're at. And, I think history, it tells something, but then you go back and remember where you were because of it. But I feel like there's so many things in the world today. History cannot be told. And when we go to school, when the kids go to school nowadays, history can't be told in one given year of what it is, or given 2 years of what it is. Nowadays it takes I think you could sit there and be in school for all the way up through high school and all the way up through college learning about what history is, because there's so much of it anymore. And each era has its own, excuse the expression, history. So, and I think it's good for people to learn, and I think everybody should learn what history is and what the background of different countries are. It's very interesting how we have got to where we are today. What history is and what you see based on what it is at the moment, I think you have to go past the moment and look back, because you don't realize what that moment is until you get past it, and then reflect back on it to understand really what it was, because you don't know that yet. And so now we can reflect back on those times as you're asking these questions, and you can see in the broad sense of what it is now, more so than what maybe it was at the time.